Hello and welcome to your third recording, where we are going to look at the impact on children and families where there has been sexual abuse experienced within the family. So this recording is just under half an hour, it's about 27-ish minutes, and we're going to look in depth at the impact of this abuse on the family, and we're very much thinking about it as a family-based issue, so we'll have a broad perspective on that topic in this recording.
So again, this is going to feature some quotes from children, and so I think looking after your emotions within this is key, and giving yourself a little bit of time afterwards just to process what you've heard is probably a good idea. So one of the main things that comes from the research about impact is that children feel a great sense of guilt and shame. Allnock in 2010 said that children who are sexually abused can be manipulated by their abuser to believe that the abuse is their fault. Feelings of shame and guilt that come from the abuse reduce the likelihood of that child making a disclosure. When I was little, Grandpa used to rub my back and later other parts of my body. One night he used his penis instead of his hand and it felt weird, so I pulled away. He was very understanding and said we didn't need to do that now. But when he seemed distant over the next few weeks, I was afraid that I didn't seem special anymore. I remember I really tried to get his attention. I think I even asked him to play the rubbing game with me. One night when we were alone, he suggested we play the rubbing game in the special way that he showed me. He asked if that was okay, and I said it didn't matter because I just wanted him to like me. Later, he told me I'd better not tell anyone, as I'd asked him to do it, and they would think that I was a bad girl. So in this quote from somebody who very kindly put up their story on the Truth Project, you can see how the relationship is manipulated and how her grandfather groomed her into feeling responsible for the abuse, setting up the situation so that she asks him to play the game, and so therefore how can she feel that it was anything but her fault because she's the one who requested it, not being emotionally mature enough to understand that that was the way that Grandpa got her to do what he wanted and to manipulate her. And then she goes on to talk about how he would withdraw the affection from her if she didn't do what he wanted, and then asking her to keep the secrets and framing her as a bad girl if she didn't keep the secret. So we know from young people's disclosures in Childline that there are a range of feelings that children go through, from sadness, finding they're having spells of crying, feeling worthless, hopeless, again guilty and frightened. Many children talked about having social anxiety and panic attacks and not being able to cope socially, feeling very withdrawn. Powerless. Some children talked about self-harming and coping behaviours. Other children felt exhausted, couldn't sleep, and had changes in their appetite. My dad hit me a lot when I was younger. He touched me in places that were not right. I feel like what happened was my fault and I shouldn't have been a naughty child. I don't remember the last time I was happy. I just always feel sad. If you're interested in this research, it's by Jackson et al. And it talks through all the different ways that children talked about their sexual abuse and gives us also some data on who the children reported were the perpetrators of the abuse in their circumstances. So one of the key things to think about when we're thinking of impact is that it's a family issue. So it might be that we have non-abusing parents within the family and somebody who was a friend of the family or another relative was the person who perpetrated the abuse. So we may well have non-abusing parents, we may have siblings. The impact of this type of abuse spans far wider than the person who was actually abused. It's a family impact, and it's important when we're thinking about intervention that we take into account every member of the family, because families function as a unit, and something like this happens within a family, the ripples are immense and affect both family and friends. So some of the things that families talk about in terms of feelings and emotions, a lot of guilt from everybody. Parents, why didn't we see it? Siblings, why wasn't it me? What happened? Why was it just this person that was selected? Am I not loved enough? Why didn't the sibling tell anybody? All sorts of conflictual emotions are apparent for all members of the family. Blame, torn loyalties, a lot of anger, not knowing where to place the anger, who to place it with, a lot of jealousy, often emotions that sometimes onlookers find it hard to fathom. But it makes a lot of sense when you think about that the grooming process is presented as a show of love and affection, and consequently there are then games played with different family members around love and affection, of which the sexual abuse can be a part of that game plan. Everybody has similar feelings within this unit, maybe for slightly different reasons, but there are lots of parallels for how people feel within the family, parents, siblings, and the person who was abused themselves. When I spoke to my gran, I asked her who she believed, because at the time she was still living with him, still living in the same house, still under the same roof, everything, the same bed, all of it. And I said, who do you believe? And she went, well, sometimes I believe you, some days I believe him, but I don't know. And with that I was gone. Don't talk to me, don't want anything to do with you, you're meant to be my grandmum, my blood, and you've still chosen him. And I had a lot of anger. I think she now wears his ring, his wedding ring, on a necklace, and that drives me crazy. I just want to pull it off and throw it down the drain. So you can see with this one young woman who talks about her grandmother's divided loyalties for her son who abused his daughter, the girl in question, and the daughter's difficulty in comprehending how it is that her grandmother can sometimes believe her and sometimes not. And these are very common responses in these situations, and there's a lot of support needs for people like Gran to come to terms with understanding her feelings around her loyalties to her son, her inability to comprehend that he could do something like that, but then loving her granddaughter, wanting to believe her granddaughter. But if she does believe her, then what does that mean about her son and her role as the mother? All very complex, conflictual feelings. So thinking specifically about the impact for the child who is abused, Horwath says the longer the abuse continues and the greater the number of stages that abuse continues through, the more disturbed the child is likely to be, the more depressed and sad, and the greater their loss of self-esteem. Research also talks about the impact being relative to the closeness of the perpetrator to the victim. So the closer the relationship, the greater the impact. How old the child was when the abuse started. On average, the abuse starts somewhere between 5 and 8. But again, if it starts from when the child is a baby, it can be more complex because the child won't have memories of those early years, and so it'll be difficult for them to process or recall those memories because their body will have experienced the abuse, but their mind will have difficulty in processing the experience. So again, the younger the child is, the more complex the recovery. And how many people facilitated the abuse? So the more people who perpetrated it, the greater the impact. But we know that there are people who have said that they didn't have a great deal of impact from the sexual abuse that was perpetrated against them. And then other people have said it's been devastating and it's totally taken over their whole life. So impact is very individual, but there are some themes to help us think about the level of intervention that might be helpful for each member of the family.
In the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in 2018, they were able to bring together all of the different elements of impact and put them into these quite useful breakdowns of looking at it. And I think it can be quite useful for assessment when we're thinking about impact on each child. What are we seeing in terms of their physical health? Have we attended to all of their physical needs? What about their emotional, their internalising of their behaviours and their externalising behaviours? How are we supporting them with those? What kind of relationships have they got? Is there repair that needs to happen within the relationships? Has this affected their socio-economic situation? For example, if the person who is committing the abuse was the provider for that family, or the family's had to move, where are they now? What's the situation like? How likely are they to be re-victimised? What do we understand about that with this child's context? And do we need to consider any specific religious and spiritual beliefs? Has the trauma affected the way that this person, this child now sees the world? What has it done to the way that families see the world? Is it in conflict with the way that this family or this child saw the ideas of kind of fate or right or wrong, family? So how are we attending to those? So we can use all of these to help frame the piece of work that we're going to offer this child post-abuse.
Alexander called the impact of sexual abuse a chronic neurologic disease, the effects of which creates decades of negative consequences for victims. That it's wired into all our cells, and it's chronic, as in it's long term. Finkelhorn Brown developed something called the traumagenics dynamics model, which you have more on in your handbook. And they talk about four main categories of dynamics that intertwine with one another in relation to child sexual abuse. And that is a sense of trust and betrayal. Who can you possibly trust? Can you trust yourself if you were manipulated into asking for the abuse? The level of betrayal that you feel from the person who perpetrated it and maybe other members of your family. Traumatic sexualization. So if you're brought into your sexual identity through a trauma, then that can create feelings around your relationship with your body, your relationship with sex, what that means for you, what you understand sex to be. And one of the consequences that is that children can have really early onset of a traumatic sexual identity, and maybe then go on to have other sexual relationships with other young people, maybe earlier than other children, or maybe have sexual play that's inappropriate with other children. It can alter the way children's sexualization progresses and takes it out of the expected sexual development pathways. Children talk about a lot of stigma, feeling that everyone knows they're dirty and disgusting, for example, as one child says. And there's also a sense of powerlessness. Powerlessness within the relationship where the sexual abuse is perpetrated, and powerless to stop it because of what it would mean to you and your family if you were to try and make it stop. and maybe you have no idea how to make it stop. So again, feelings of real powerlessness within that. So some examples of what people have said about these traumagenics. It was the only place I had to go, and he made me do it again, touch him, and then he'd touch me. And after a while I didn't even care. I began to hate him, and yet I spent time with him. I began to wonder, who could I trust? Could I even trust myself? An example of stigmatization. I felt like I had this big red letter on me telling everyone what an evil, dirty person I was. And these quotes have been taken from Cynthia Crossan-Towers' book. So we're going to think briefly about the impact on siblings in families where children or a child have experienced sexual abuse. They can be one of the most forgotten members in the family when it comes to intervention. I've seen it a lot in the training room where people have talked about the child who directly experienced the abuse, receiving therapy, but other children in the family not being considered to have any needs, which, as we said in the beginning, it's a family issue, and there will be an impact on all of the children, different for different reasons, but there will still be an impact, and therefore will still have treatment needs. There's a variety of ways that children can react to being in these environments, and from either hearing it or witnessing it or finding out afterwards that it happened. Some children act out the abuse in different ways. Some act it out in sexual ways towards other children, and some may even then commit further abuse on younger siblings. So it's important to think about what the impact on the siblings might be and whether there are any risks around that. So let's think now about non-offending parents. There's a charity called MOSAC, which is national, which offers support to non-abusing parents. So check that out if you're working with families where there's non-abusing parents. One of the girls in the child line, the Jackson research, says she, my mum, blames herself a lot because obviously she was pretty much drinking throughout the relationship, on and off. So I think she feels as though she should have noticed something, or she let it happen. She has a lot of guilt around it. So thinking now about the impact on non-offending parents, there's a really good blog on the CSA Centre website talking about the treatment and support needs for non-offending parents. Some of the things that Alagia not talk about in their research are anxiety and tension and guilt. Guilt's a really big one. Why didn't I see it? Or why did I interpret it as this? Waves of anxiety affecting sleep, just feeling exhausted, all trauma, all impacts of trauma. And even though the abuse wasn't directly affecting them, non-offending parents are still groomed and there is still a trauma that they go through, and so processing that trauma can take a while, and there's lots of feelings within that parents report. They feel really judged by professionals asking them why they didn't see it, or whether they were enabling the abuse to happen. So parents have talked a lot about how they had a lot of support needs, but maybe those weren't recognised by workers. One of the more difficult feelings to process for parents is ambivalence, particularly for mums, when maybe the abuser was, dad or stepdad or someone that mum was in a relationship with, and I've heard mums talk about how they felt jealousy towards their child, which is a perfectly natural feeling, given the complexity of the relationship. and the loss that goes with that relationship when you learn that this abuse has taken place within your family. So on a rational basis, maybe the parent understands and recognises that it's not the child's fault, but on a subconscious, irrational basis, maybe they're thinking, what did the child do to make it happen? And those are very natural feelings that people have, and the person just needs time to process it and to be able to admit feelings that are difficult, because it's all part of the trauma. Family support interventions that focus on non-abusive parents managing their feelings have good outcomes. The LTFI NSPCC programme has that model, and it's shown that supporting parents then supports children, because parents have all of the feelings that they go through, and they need somewhere to take those feelings so that they can manage them, and then that way they are emotionally available for their child. You can find the NSPCC research for the LTFI programme on their website if you're interested. From a trauma processing perspective, features such as denial, unfocused anger, minimisation of the problem, and ambivalence towards both the alleged victim and abuser would be considered part of the course rather than evidence of toxic parenting or deep-seated psychopathology. This is Chaffin, which reiterates what I've just said about the complex range of emotions that family members go through. And you can see the reference for the blog that I referred to earlier at the bottom of the page. So one of the things that's important to think about is, and this links in with the gender issue, is that each family will have its own culture, and it'll have an understanding of sexual abuse and gender and sex and gender roles and sexuality. And before we think about what interventions might be necessary and risk also for children within the family, we have to understand the family's culture. What are the morals? What are the attitudes? What about shame? Is that an issue for this family? Where does the responsibility for the abuse lie? Is there an idea of fate around this family's culture? Is the child that's been abused now seen as damaged? And if so, what does this mean for them and their family? Is virginity important? How would the family react if the victim is a male and the perpetrator is a male? What does that say about the family? What does that say about the young person? So all of these things need to be considered. Fonts suggests thinking about all of these 5 areas before we really get to grips with what interventions may be appropriate, because it might be that there are additional risks for the children depending on what we understand about the family's culture. So this is your final slide with your reflective practice. I'd like to suggest that there's a few things that you do. Access the Truth Project and find a couple of personal accounts to read, and the link is here. Sign up to the CSA Centre and get their email notification, and maybe if you've got time, read the short blog on parents, and go and have a look at the Mosaic website so that you're familiar with it and will remember if you come across families with these circumstances that you can refer them for support through Mosaic. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you at the live session. Take care.